is Radio Prague International, coming to you from the Czech capital.
Hello and welcome to Radio Prague International. I'm Sierra Krieger-Wolf. In today's program, we're going to look at yesterday's Fragile Security Conference focused on the war in Ukraine as the defining security challenge. Then we'll discuss the spring frost that has destroyed about half of this season's domestic harvest. And we will also look at the Prague Open House event, highlighting urban transformation in Prague. And to finish our segment, we'll follow Benjamin Suchek on his mission to restore stately homes. All that and more, but first the news with Ian Willoughby.
News.
President Petr Pavel says if a government decision on the composition of a Czech delegation for a NATO summit in July restricts the constitutional rights attached to his role, he'll take the matter to the Constitutional Court. He made the comments on Thursday. Presidents have usually represented Czechia at NATO conferences in the past. However, Prime Minister Andrej Babiš says he's not counting on Mr. Pavel being part of the country's delegation at the summit in Turkey. Mr. Pavel has been critical of the Babiš government's plans for defence spending, and the Prime Minister has said he himself would be better placed to explain Czechia's position. A decision on who will be included in the Czech delegation is set for the 8th of June. President Pavel says NATO and the EU are not competitors when it comes to European defence, but should complement one another. He made the comment at the start of the Globsec Forum, a three-day international security conference that began in Prague on Thursday. Mr. Pavel called for continued support for Ukraine, which he said was not only defending Europe in its efforts to repel the Russians, but also changing the way Europe thinks about warfare. A representative of the Václav Havel Library says new donors have expressed interest in supporting the institution. David Dušek, who is the only remaining member of its board of directors, said it will continue operating next year. The rest of the board of directors stood down recently. Two key donors have said they're cutting ties with the library, and many staff members have given notice. The director of the Václav Havel Library, economist Tomáš Sedláček, has been criticised by some of those departing over his stewardship of the non-profit, established in 2004. Plans have been revealed for the overhaul of Miloš Forman Square in Prague's Old Town. The small plaza, named after the famous film director, is set to get a pavilion that will protect it from the noise of the adjacent Pařížská Street. The project was presented on Thursday by Anders Lonka from the Danish architectural studio Adept, which won a competition for the commission. The space was named after the Oscar-winning Czech-born Forman about 6 months after his death in 2018 at the age of 86. Alexander Zmayevsky has concluded his term as Russian ambassador to the Czech Republic after more than 10 years. The news site hlidací.cz reported on Thursday, citing a Czech Foreign Ministry list of diplomatic officials that no longer features his name. Mr. Zmayevsky's last act as ambassador was evidently being summoned to the Czech Foreign Ministry last month to explain remarks from Russian representatives that Czech drone makers could be targeted by Russia. And the weather forecast, it should be mainly sunny in Czechia on Friday with an average high temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. Similar temperatures are expected on the following days.
That was the news, and we turn now to current affairs. At the Fragile Security Conference organized by Czech Radio, political, military, and intelligence leaders debated Europe's future security in an increasingly unstable world. Czech President Petr Pavel, Ukrainian envoy Valery Zaluzny, and other prominent international voices warned that Ukraine's war remains a test of democratic resilience and Western resolve. Vít Pohanka has the details.
The Prague gathering, organized by Czech Radio, brought together senior political leaders, military commanders, intelligence figures, journalists, and civil society voices to debate the changing nature of conflict, democratic resilience, and the future of Europe's defense. President Petr Pavel used the conference to underline what he sees as the Czech Republic's practical contribution to Ukraine's defense and why that crucial Czech support mustn't stop.
Za prvé je to pokračování v muniční iniciativě.
First, continue the ammunition initiative. This project has become one of the Czech Republic's most visible contributions to European security. Our country managed to connect partners, logistics and capacities where they were most needed. The Czech Republic currently provides approximately half of all large caliber ammunition being delivered for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Pro potřeby ukrajinské armády.
According to Valery Zaluzhny, Ukrainian ambassador to London and formerly commander-in-chief of Ukrainian armed forces, Russia's war against Ukraine has demonstrated how profoundly warfare is changing, not only through new technologies and strategies, but also through sophisticated propaganda, disinformation, and other hidden efforts designed to weaken an opponent's will to resist.
Сьогодні з досвіду України я лише кажу про те, що фактор безпеки та спроможності держави його забезпечити є...
Today, from Ukraine's experience, said Valery Zaluzhny, security and state's ability to provide it is the foundation not only of stability, but also of economic prosperity.
Час змін прийшов.
The time for change has come, added Ambassador Zaluzhny. For President Pavel, the challenge is not only about helping Ukraine, but also about strengthening resilience at home here in Czechia.
Bezpečnost, obrana země a všech jejich občanů by rozhodně neměla...
The security and defence of the country and all its citizens should absolutely not become a subject of political rivalry. I welcome the fact that our government has declared security a strategic priority, along with fulfilling our alliance obligations. But credibility is not built only through what we say and do externally. It begins within society. That's why we must also build our own resilience, the ability not to succumb to manipulation, to maintain trust in our own institutions, and not allow ourselves to be undermined from outside or from within.
Ani zvenčí, ani zevnitř.
Finally, former MI6 chief Sir Richard Moore from Britain made the argument that continued support for Ukraine is about much more than Europe alone.
Czech Republic has been one of the most prominent supporters of Ukraine since 22. We need to keep that going, because if we falter, if we fail to meet that challenge, not only will Putin's appetite grow with the eating, you know, he may be emboldened to do other things which are damaging to Western security, but behind him, President Xi Jinping is watching this, and he will make judgments about the Western resolve, and he will make judgments, therefore, on what he does in the South China Sea, what he does in Taiwan critically. So there are all kinds of reasons why, for me, Ukraine is the central struggle of our time.
So, for Sir Moore, as for many security officials in Europe, the outcome of the war in Ukraine will shape not only the future of this continent, but potentially the wider global balance of power.
Veet Pohanka with that report. Orchard owners in several regions are dealing with the consequences of the frosts. According to preliminary estimates by the Fruit Growers Union, the harvest will be roughly half of the average, and the damage could reach hundreds of millions of crowns. Romana Grajcerova has more.
The threat of spring frosts is now probably over. Fruit growers in Czechia can therefore begin to count the damage in orchards. The impacts of the frost vary locally, but in places such as the village of Tulešice in the Moravský Krumlov area, no apricot harvest is expected this year. On Jiří Kopeček's farm, the damage is clearly visible at first sight.
V celém sadě o rozloze 1 hektaru jsem našel pár plodů.
In the entire orchard covering 1 hectare, I only found a few apricots, so there will be no harvest at all. Moreover, about 50% of apples and about 40% of plums were destroyed too. It will show in the sense that there was basically no profit, which is unfortunate because we have to take care of the trees all year. We have to prune them, care for them, and when there is nothing to harvest afterwards, it shows.
There is not much effective protection against frost beyond measures such as burning paraffin candles. Even when they are used, it is not certain that future fruit will survive the frost.
First of all, it is a gamble, and it is not worthwhile for us because we farm organically, which means we generally have lower yields, and if the cost of candles is, for example, 40,000 per hectare, it cannot pay off.
According to the Fruit Growers Union of the Czech Republic, this year's spring frost destroyed about half of the domestic harvest. The damage varies significantly by region. The situation in South Moravia is described by Ivo Pokorný, chairman of the Fruit Growers Union of Moravia and Silesia.
Jižní Morava to odnesla dost. Budeme se spoléhat na import a
South Moravia took a hard hit. We will have to rely on imports, and the 2026 season will be below average in terms of fruit growing. The frost caused quite a lot of damage.
Ty mrazy nadělali docela dost velkou paseku, se dá říct.
According to Pokorný, this will likely also be reflected in fruit prices. The frosts also caused damage in other fruit-growing regions.
Netýká se to jenom České republiky, ale odnesly to i sousední státy.
It does not concern only the Czech Republic, but also neighboring countries such as Germany and Poland, where the damage will be in the billions, so I think fruit in general will become more expensive.
Myslím si, že ovoce jako takový podraží.
The price of this year's fruit from orchards will therefore be determined by the June harvest total as well as the situation in neighboring countries. However, according to farmers, the outcome will also be significantly affected by drought, which Czechia has been facing for a long time.
That report from Romana Krejcerova. This weekend, more than 100 usually inaccessible buildings and spaces across Prague will open to the public free of charge as part of the Open House. This year's theme explores the link between historic preservation and urban development. Ruth Frankova spoke with the festival's organizer, Michaela Pankova, and first asked her about some of the highlights linked to this year's theme.
So the festival features several buildings that are currently under redevelopment. One of the story is, for example, Prague Bubny railway station, which will become a center for memory and dialogue, connecting the site of historical legacy with the vision of the future neighborhood, becoming a museum of the Holocaust history. Another of them is, for example, the Severin riding hall, which is a part of a large Baroque complex in the center of Prague, and visitors will be able to see the building just before the reconstruction. There are also several buildings which are reconstructed already, but they serve totally new purpose, such as, for example, Braník Brewery, which is now a dance art center and seat of various institutions. There is also some other technical sites, for example, Pragovka, which will become a new art district. It's also former industrial site, or Areál Podkovářská.
One of this year's highlights is the former Stroj Import building in the Vinohrady district, which is opening as part of this year's tribute to architect Zdeněk Kuna, marking 100 years since his birth. What makes this building such an important example of late modernist architecture in the city?
So the design of this former headquarters of Stroj Import was inspired by Western high-rise buildings, such as the Severin building in New York City. And it's located on Vinohradská Avenue, and it has a unique construction that features a core made of reinforced concrete and a steel frame. So at the time, the interiors of these buildings were highly representative and typically designed in collaboration with the renowned artists such as Stanislav Libenský or Jaroslava Brichtová, whose works visitors can still find inside.
The festival is also marking several other major architectural anniversaries this year. What are some of the other buildings or architects you are highlighting in the program?
So one of the biggest highlights of this year's festival is the former post office palace located on the Václavské Square. It was designed by the architect František Rojt, whose 150th birth anniversary we also commemorate this year. And it's a monumental neoclassical building with a beautiful representative interior, which served as a bank office. But soon it will become the new home of the Prague City Office Hall, who will move here from the Škoda Palace.
Open House Prague always gives people a chance to discover places normally closed to the public. Is there one building in this year's program that you think visitors will find especially surprising?
It's hard to pick a building from such a large program of more than 100 buildings because every visitor has a specific taste. The most desirable are those historical palaces in the historical part of Prague, such as Lobkowicz Palace, which we think will be this year's biggest highlight. It's now seat of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and people will have the opportunity to see not only the interiors but also the beautiful garden with a statue of Trabant vehicle made by David Czerny.
That was Michaela Pankova speaking there to Ruth Frankova. It is now time for today's main feature. London-born Benjamin Souček renovates stately homes in Czechia, the home of his forefathers. Indeed, Souček, who is also active in Prague's cricket circles, has even received an award at the Czech Senate for his contribution to the country's cultural heritage. Ian Willoughby has more.
London-born Benjamin Souček renovates stately homes in Czechia, the country of his forefathers. Indeed, Souček, who's also active in Prague cricket circles, has even received an award at the Czech Senate for his contribution to the country's cultural heritage. And I spoke to him here at our Prague studios. Ben, your dad is Czech. What's his story?
Yes, my dad's Czech. He left Czechoslovakia when he was 17 with his parents and his younger brother, who was 14, for Switzerland, I think with the intention of emigrating to Canada. That was their destination, via some friends that they had in Geneva, but they stopped in Bern. There was some help, I think, from a Rotary Club, from an uncle, a great uncle of mine, but my grandmother's brother, who was already in Argentina. And the Rotary Club helped them find accommodation and gave them furniture and so on, and they lived in a tiny flat, which they ended up living in all their lives in this tiny place in Switzerland, in Bern. And one way or another, with my dad's fondness for British culture, 60s music, he ended up in England, in London, and I was born there.
Did you hear Czech growing up in the household?
Through my grandparents, yes. Yes, we'd all flock to my grandparents. My dad had a lot of cousins who emigrated as well, who were very young, who didn't have their parents. So my grandfather was this fatherly figure for a wider group of youngsters.
Does your dad come here today?
Yeah, still comes here. I mean, unfortunately, he's rather unwell at the moment, but he started a business here in the 90s. My grandfather was very keen to... He was trained as a lawyer, so although he was never able to work as one because of his political views, but it always came in handy, having a legal experience. So he was very keen to try and get my grandmother's family's property back, and he managed to get some of it back. And then once they'd got it back in the 90s, he was very keen as a Czech patriot to renovate it, and my father was involved in that too.
What about you? When did you start coming here? Or when did you first come here?
When did I first come here? Again, in the 90s, I suppose, following my father. We had a family reunion in 1991. And we'd met relations that we'd never met before because you couldn't cross the Iron Curtain. And those that had left had refused to come back. There was a way of coming back, and you could make some apologies and bow down to the regime as things began to unfreeze in the late 80s, but mostly my family refused to do that. I did go on one trip with my grandparents, which I remember when I was very, very young, and we met two great aunties, Blažena and Jarmilka, at Lake Balaton in Hungary. And my grandparents were pointing out that over there is Czechoslovakia, that's where we're from, but we can't go there. So that was quite exciting. You could see all the Trabants and everything. But so I came back in 1991, and we all met in Pecspodsnižko, where a relation had booked out a whole Čeká D hotel. It was a vast place, and it was just for our family, about 20 of us. And we all had massive argument because, of course, those that had remained in the communist regime and those that had left didn't see eye to eye.
What led you to move here, or when did you move here?
So I went to university here for a bit, at Masaryk University, via the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Yeah, I was kicking my heels in London, having finished my studies, and I was keen to come here, so I came here. Things were more affordable. I managed to find a flat in Vinohrady that I could have a roof over my head, which gave me the confidence to propose to my wife, and then I persuaded her to come over here as well.
And your wife is Czech, or?
Yeah.
And she's an architect?
She's an architect. But we met in London.
You renovate castles or old buildings. Had you some background in construction or renovation in the UK, or how did you get into this whole field?
I suppose my father led me into it. He'd always worked on renovating old buildings as a sort of side project. So since I was very young, my first job, I remember taking the ferry from Newhaven to Dieppe and working on barns in Brittany when I was about 15, just as I finished my GCSEs. And so that stayed with me, yeah. And I was very lucky recently to finish a renovation of a 18th century rectory in Bilzenski Kraj, near Chunenice, for which I received a reward. A reward. It was a reward. And I was invited to the Senate and, given special praise for my services to Czech cultural heritage.
Were people open to a foreigner coming here and offering to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of Czech companies weren't interested in doing that kind of work because it's very difficult to calculate the costs and estimate how long it's going to take. But, Prague's a UNESCO World City. It's beautiful. And I remember just walking around and gazing up at these buildings and thinking, my God, all this needs to be repaired. There's an opportunity here.
And what are the biggest challenges typically when you are renovating a very old, often, I guess, protected building?
Well, one of the largest challenges is finding the investment and having quite deep pockets. That's a huge challenge.
And do you typically work on commission for clients, or will you buy a property, do it up and sell it on?
A little bit of both. Luckily enough, a little bit of both. You have to have a special relationship with a client, especially if you don't know how much the project's going to cost. So I want to do the work, but I can't do the work if we don't get paid.
Why is it so hard to estimate the cost?
Well, because you won't know what's wrong with the building. So you take off all the tiles on the roof and you'll find that the main ring beam has turned to dust. The whole weight of the roof is pushing the walls, the main structural walls out. So you might find that you have to tie the whole building together, and then you've got to replace all the beams, and you want to retain as much of the original structure as you can. So you will chase in reclaimed beams with existing ones and so on.
I'm always hearing about how Czech tradesmen are so skilled in so many areas. Is it the same when it comes to your line of work?
That's a little bit of an old wives' tale. It's true, when I first came here, everyone said Czechs were particularly skilled. They had to be, because they needed to be able to renovate their own property because there was no one available to do it. So every man became quite skilled. But no, unfortunately, less and less young people are interested in going into the trades. I think it's the same problem across Europe. And I was very fortunate to meet a couple of young Ukrainians who came over just as they'd finished school 15 years ago and have been with me ever since. And we've worked together and grown together. They've learnt off me and I've learnt off them.
Is your dad also involved in your business here? Because I was reading some articles about you and I saw his name, Andrzej Soczek, listed there as well.
Well, together we discovered that the Czech bishopric was putting up lots of its property for sale in Budějovický kraj and Plzeňský kraj, and I initially bidded on a place. Luckily I didn't win it, because I wouldn't have wanted to be wedded to this place. And then a year or two later, he followed in my footsteps and bidded on this rectory that he bought for not very much money. Of course, the investment that was then required turned out to be enormous. So yes, he was the client in that project. We worked together.
And
it was sort of a little bit of a golden circle. The money that he received from his rent that he was getting thanks to my grandfather's restitution, he was reinvesting into Czech cultural heritage, which was quite a nice kind of closed circle.
Are there a lot of properties crying out, like old properties, crying out to be renovated? If you drive around the countryside, do you see lots of places you think I could do something with that?
Yeah, I do think that. I mean, you need to have, quite thick skin and brace. It's not they're not easy, but more and more people seem to be turning to renovate the countryside. More and more I go around the countryside and up into former Sudety, I can see new roofs. As Prague gets more and more expensive, people are looking to go further away.
And say, for example, if you do up an old chateau, will that afterwards be really a great place to live? I mean, I'm sure the rooms are huge, they're hard to heat, I'm guessing.
If the house has been properly insulated and you heat with traditional methods, stoves, you have a supply of wood, hopefully a little forest nearby, yeah, why not?
And do people, your clients, prefer to keep the original look of the place, or will you get some, like I say, some chateau which maybe has like super modern interiors that you've installed?
Yeah, you could do that. The house would have had to have been derelict beforehand, because otherwise the Heritage Office wants to be involved and they would like you to retain as many original features as possible. It just depends on the state of how dilapidated the place is to begin with.
What's the process of getting permits to do this kind of work?
It's hard, and to involve the Heritage Office, put it this way, we've been involved with the Heritage Office because grants were available, but the grants in the end turned out to be so minimal, perhaps not involving the Heritage Office with the benefit of hindsight would have been better.
And they make you jump through hoops, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
You're also a cricket man, I was reading. Are you a member of a club, I presume you are?
Yes, Vinohrady. And
do you actually play games, or is it only training? Or who, if you play games, who against?
We play a lot of games. The founding cricket club in Prague is Prague Cricket Club, and we were one of the first to morph out of them because there were too many of us interested at the time in playing cricket. So we were, I think, the second or the third club to be formed after Bohemians, and we created a domestic league and then a national side, and now we have lots of people playing cricket. There's clubs in Brno, Pilsen, Olomouc, and so on.
And where does the Vinohrady Cricket Club play or
We
train?
have training in Olshansky Náměstí, where we have 3 bowling lanes and nets, and that's available to all the other clubs as well, although we largely built it. And then we have a cricket ground at Vinohr, owned by Captain Hugo Banks, who served in Kosovo, and then later, through his wife, discovered that they had some agricultural land, which eventually we turned into two cricket fields.
Are all the players Brits?
No, but not by any means. A small fraction nowadays. By far the most players are Indian, but we have players from all over: Australia, Ireland, Canada, South Africa, you name it. Sri Lanka, Pakistan.
My final question is, now in the UK there is one famous Souček, Tomáš Souček, who's the Czech national football team captain. Does that make a difference if you're there now? Do people have less trouble pronouncing your name?
That's a very good question. I have noticed a little bit more awareness. My name, I always had to spell it out, and it was Souček, Souchet, or you name it. And people too seem to be a little bit more conscious about how to pronounce it. And at Calais, especially when I'm driving home, the border guards, the French border guards, ask me, "You're not related to the footballer, are you?" And I laugh and say I'm not, but it's a nice beginning to a conversation.
That interview with Benjamin Souček brings us to the end of this broadcast. I'm Sierra Krieger-Wolf, and have a beautiful rest of your day.